Well, thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here talking to Regina, who I'm a very big fan of, but we'll try and suppress my fanboy dumb and keep things, kind of official. Please interject with questions as they crop up. I have a lot of questions, probably many of which we will not get to, but I did want to start with sort of how you're self-identifying as an artist at this point. I know you've worn a lot of hats, you've curated, you've done writing, you've done lecturing, you've done installation work, you've done photography, so how would you characterize your practice as it stands?
So I also want to thank, really quickly, the submission and the mission, and Mackenzie, and Caroline, and Sebastian, and everybody for inviting me. It's been a really awesome experience. And of course, John, we've had a conversation going for almost 3 years now about utopian communities, among other things. So I just want to put that out there. But to answer your question, as you and I have talked about, I think the most important pieces of the hats that I wear are being an artist and being classically trained in photography, which has really helped, foster my installation-based practice, and then being a contemporary arts lecturer, both at the Art Institute of Chicago before I left for LA, and then also continuing to work as a lecturer there. So as we were talking, like one of the things that's always helped me in terms of being a lecturer is constantly having these artists that I'm researching from all different media and all different kinds of historical places and working processes kind of percolating and staying in the back of my mind, and not drawing from one particular artist in particular, but having this kind of mashup or tangled, sort of, I guess, mass or mess or whatever in the back of my mind, and always keeping that with me when, I'm practicing art or in my studio, so.
So with all those voices in your head, jostling about, I was curious what sort of makes you excited enough to begin a project, see it through from beginning to end? Is it a set of sort of philosophical questions, formal issues? I mean, one of the things I like about your work is that there's a sort of coherence to it, or I see a coherence. I'd like to imagine maybe I'm just making connections where there aren't any, but I'm never quite sure where you're going to go next. So for example, when we first started talking, you were a pretty somewhat straightforward photographer, and have moved kind of more into the conceptual installation sort of realm. So, but what gets you excited enough to begin a project and see it through from beginning to end?
No, I think that's a really good point, because, since we've been talking about the utopias, and being relatively straightforward with a large format camera, I think what has really prompted that is like kind of like spider webbing, like I work in a really slow process, but then each project kind of leads me to the next stage, whether I know that at the time or not. Like, for example, photographing the historical utopias, and then that kind of leading to, during that trip, visiting the historical utopias, visiting the historical spiritualist camp, and then that becoming another project. And then from there, looking at, kind of pseudoscience through the e-meters and how that is measured, and then that kind of turning into another project. So I think for me, it's a lot of like, one leads to another, and that's just kind of been the flow, whether that's intentional or by accident. So I think it's just this kind of working process that has started to become a thread in my work. So.
And could we have the next slide? So I did want to start with Electrum, and then maybe move backwards. I was thinking kind of memento style, begin in present and move chronologically backwards. And maybe as we move backwards through some of your projects and series, start to trace some of those connections. But what did inspire this interest in spirituality and pseudoscience in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. My interest in spirituality, I think, again, first started. I think for me, the unfortunately it was Paradise project that I did and showed at the water tower was a really crucial moment when I started to meld this kind of spiritual practice into my work, whether that's spirituality from more of a religious perspective or spirituality in the sense of cosmology and just kind of unknowingness. So that again kind of translated into the next project, which was about spiritualism and thinking about this sense of like attending, workshops or educational classes at the spiritualist camp and thinking about the ways in which, the community was speaking to the afterlife, but it wasn't necessarily something that was tangible, right? You kind of are having this conversation or communication with the afterlife, but you may or may not see it, in the sense of like there could be spirit photography, right? Like ectoplasm on the film, or it could just be a general sense of like mediumship where you have intuition about, spirit matter. So I guess in that way, spirituality started to translate into this idea of working with objects such as the e-meter that could potentially measure these kinds of spiritual activities, but specifically in relationship to the body, and the ways in which the body has a kind of electromagnetic energy, and skin has a kind of electric, energy that could potentially be measured. So, of course, it's not a controlled experiment that I'm doing, but at the same time, I'm interested in producing quantifiable data because I think that there is a kind of potentiality for there to inspire this idea of belief or skepticism based on providing the viewer with not just the sense of a spiritual experience, but also with the sense that possibly data is being collected or produced for the viewer.
And so Electrum is a site-responsive installation, and I was curious, what about the specific space of the submission gallery being, sort of subterranean, no windows, it has a slightly haunted, eerie quality to it. So what about the site itself, sort of suggested this particular arrangement of the e-meters? And I was also interested in the role of the body of the viewer in relationship to the e-meters. And it seems to me as though they play, the body itself plays a larger role maybe in this installation than in some of your other projects. So if you could speak to kind of the site itself and the role of the body of the viewer in relationship, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Because one of the things that I was most drawn to about submitting an application for the submission space was the relationship to the work that I wanted to produce and the type of space that it was created in that, like that I had the opportunity to completely control the light source, that I had the opportunity to work in a space that was in a basement. It has a kind of, already, even before, installing the show, I felt like there was this kind of aura or presence, this sort of like, what I have described to you as the like, ooh, like the, a really mystical sense of being in a space. Having been to other shows here at the Mission, the Submission, I immediately felt very drawn to that work in relationship to the psychometrics, the work that I had done with the e-meters, as well as just general concepts of spirituality. So in addition, I was also thinking about this way in which this site-responsive work could take on almost the sort of role of like a seance room, like something that is done in the spiritualist camp is creating a kind of what I would think of as like sort of a sacred space where seances are conducted. So it's this very designated, cleaned out, and kind of energized space for the participants. And I think for me that was very important about this site-responsive installation, was creating a kind of sacred, or in looser terms, a kind of energized space that could potentially inspire like the sense of paranormal activity, or both positive and negative, vibrations or atmosphere. So.
Well, and I wanted to kind of point to and ask a little bit about the tension between sort of the seance-like quality of the atmosphere down there, and also this tension with quantitative sort of experimentation, a controlled environment. There's obviously a tension between sort of belief and skepticism. I've described you informally as a sort of Mulder and Scully wrapped up into one, sort of the believer and the skeptic at the same time. So obviously the E-meter is functioning very prominently in some of your current work. And if we go to the next slide, I'm thinking of psychometrics, for example, that was at the Chicago Artists Coalition. So you're very interested in the E-meter as both an object, as a sort of fetish. How is the E-meter functioning for you? And you might even just describe for other people here what it actually is and what it sort of claims to do.
Sure. So the E-meter is a electric psychometer, and essentially it's supposed to pick up kind of like psychological traumas or psychological states, and help you read and find where you might have traumatic memories that you might need to work out to obtain a higher spiritual state. So it's essentially reading your aura, your auric state, but it's also from a more physical perspective, kind of reading the electromagnetic energy that's radiating from the body. So it's a device that's supposed to, on a more metaphorical sense, kind of read you from an overall psychological experience. So.
And in some of your earlier work, which we'll get to, you're obviously very interested, or had been interested, in the camera as a mechanical device that has at various points made claims about being able to capture the spirit world, the ineffable thing about spiritualist photography, or people's fear of having their souls captured by the camera. So I just wanted to ask whether or not you see a parallel between the E-meter as an object, a mechanical device that seems to make some of these claims about an ability to read someone's energy or spirit or soul, or where, their psychic states, and how you've been using the camera in your photographic practice to try and capture the unseen or the invisible, and if you see a connection there at all.
Yeah, again, I mean, not to flog the dead horse, but I feel like it again started with the Utopia project, because that for me was really a turning point in my artistic practice, in terms of being frustrated with the camera as a tool to capture, again, these kinds of more metaphysical or cosmology, questions of cosmology, or these kinds of spiritual states. So I think for me, this shift again toward using the E-meter as an apparatus was a way to move away from classical photography. Yet at the same time, with this particular work, I kind of did both at the same time. This is this earlier process where I used both the camera to photograph the apparatus, but I was also very much interested in the E-meter as an apparatus to kind of capture that psychological state, even though it could not be seen. And like I've talked with you about, I almost feel like in this photograph, the two kind of cancel each other out, because it's supposed to be more of a commercialized image, more about kind of advertising, and then it becomes less, to me personally, about either apparatuses. Either It's not necessarily about a working or functioning e-meter, and it's not necessarily about, capturing this e-meter through, even though it is a shot with a camera, it's not necessarily about the apparatus of the camera. It's more about this billboard in a way. It's more about this commercialized, sexy, aesthetic object where I almost start to see the work less as a photograph and more of a kind of object, an object that is representative of presenting the e-meter in this like sexy, seductive, again, commercialized presentation. So.
I mean, that leads me to a question I'd been wanting to ask you about the move from Chicago to LA. And the idea of the billboard, the fetishized object, monumentalizing, this part. It's a very seductive object. It has a kind of retro, vintage, cool quality to it. You can think about the 50s and 2001: A Space Odyssey or whatever. So were you really drawn to it aesthetically as much as anything else? And can we read into this anything about sort of your practice being LA-based at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the cliches of, LA are, right, like crystals and dream catchers and, this sort of like kind of metaphysical, state that everyone's in terms of, just what they're thinking about. I think what helped for me being in LA was, I started these projects and I started to think about these projects in LA, but it was actually prior to moving when I was doing the residency in Joshua Tree through Summer Forum that I started to think more of the landscape as holding this kind of cosmological state, thinking again about space or the desert, in parts of even the West where one can remake themselves, but also you can place that new identity onto the landscape because it's so cleared and cleaned out, right? It's very cleared out of flora and fauna. So therefore personally, I felt like you could place your sorts of identity and expectations onto the landscape itself. And for that reason, especially when I was in Joshua Tree, I found that there's often a lot of spaces that incorporate people talking about vortices, kinds of spiritual energy, a kind of essence or intuitive qualities that they feel when they're in the desert, and these kinds of like vision quests that, people go out in the desert and, do like what have you, like psychotropics, to have these sorts of experiences in this state where they can be, where they are not dealing directly or dealing indirectly with the kind of desert life. So I think that's like a very sort of long-winded way of saying like, yes, LA has definitely helped my practice, but I think more so in less direct ways, so.
Yeah. We go to that next slide. Because I was curious about how you're using the e-meter in Electrum as this very, as I mentioned, kind of haunted and eerie. And you come to this series and there is a feeling of kind of maybe playfulness or a different relationship to how the e-meter is functioning. Did you just want to speak to how the e-meter is functioning here versus in Electrum and kind of how these two projects are either related or different? And this is Grounding Objects from this year.
Yeah, so this show was happening, the two works from the Grounding Objects series that I showed just came down. It was in Slow Gallery in Pilsen. And so the image on the right, Grounding Object number 2, was actually one of my first works solely with e-meters, not incorporating the photographic element. When I got to LA, and these are actually they're not functional e-meters. And so I was thinking just solely of the e-meter as like an aesthetic object, not as something that functions, but solely the way that it looks, almost like a designed, piece of furniture or something of that matter. So with grounding object, particularly the one on the right, I was thinking about the electrical implications of the e-meter, which is to read electric energy in the body, but also to sort of reference back to other pieces that I've done where I pointed out electricity both within the piece and around in the gallery, which is something that we really take for granted as artists and makers, that, of course there's going to be electricity in a space, right? But it's something that's invisible. It's not something that's often mentioned. So again, drawing attention to something that is unseen, it's invisible, but it's also something that's, part of our daily life and our daily routine. So like kind of in like a really direct sort of one-to-one relationship, I think this particular work is a little bit more simplistic, but thinking about filling, balloons with helium, which is also an unseen substance, and then over time, these balloons obviously deflate, and that relationship to the e-meters slowly changes over time.
You mentioned electricity, and it does seem as though power outlets feature prominently in your work, black lights. And I mean, to me, this was maybe something of a transitional piece, because you can see the photographs on the wall, but you've subjected them to this sort of interrogation, this black light interrogation. And I also think of the image on the right, the photographs on the ground with the volcanic stones, grounding them to the ground as relating maybe to grounding objects, and also how that relates to electricity and conduction and so on. But I always wondered if the black lights operated as a kind of surrogate for you here. These objects that are sort of subjecting these photographs to sort of ruthless or pitiless investigation. And I compared you at one point in a review to a sort of conjurer over a pool trying to get more from the surface than is actually there, a kind of paranormal investigator. I mean, how does the black light function? Because that's featured prominently in Electrum as well. And is it a kind of artist stand-in?
I think that's a good question. I don't know if it's necessarily, I don't know if I'm answering your question properly, but I don't know if it's necessarily an artist stand-in, but it's definitely something that I started to think about in relationship to my photographic training. As I think I mentioned to you before, it happened for me when I was at the spiritualist camp for the first time, and they mentioned, they meaning the spiritualists and the mediums, mentioned that if I photographed at a certain point on the campgrounds where there was a vortex, that I would, because I was shooting film, which is obviously analog and part of this history of ectoplasm and spirit photography, that I would in fact get ectoplasm or orbs on the photographs. So when I came back and I developed the film and I had the work printed, through that power of suggestion, I started to kind of believe, even though I was skeptical of that, to believe that something might be there. So once that seed was planted for me, I couldn't unsee it. So I started to look at the photograph differently, even though they were banal landscapes. I really scrutinized the photographs, as you said, under black light, which is obviously a tool of detection for underpaintings, for historical markings, flaws, in forensics, as a way to kind of scrutinize the photograph. If I could not see it with the naked eye, was it possible that I could see it under different lighting conditions? So I think that's the kind of response that I've had since then, which is using the black light almost as like a tool of detection, and then now pushing it more towards an aesthetic reflection.
That leads me to, because I remember visiting your studio and you were talking about your experience in these spiritualist workshops, astrology. I think at one point you may have had a workshop in being a medium. And of course, that made me start thinking about the camera as a medium and the body as a medium and so on and so forth. But, more generally, what role does sort of research play in your work, researching these histories and these traditions? And and if you could speak as well to the sort of tension between your immersion in some of these cultures and histories, but also maintaining something of a skeptical detachment or remove.
Yeah, when it comes to my own art, I'm a terrible researcher. When it comes to my job in contemporary arts, I hope that I'm a good researcher, but I tend to take facts and again, going back to this pseudo, putting on this pseudo hat of an anthropologist when I'm looking at work and kind of picking and choosing what I like and I'm not interested in it and kind of discarding it. So I'm almost creating these kinds of new, for me, personal narratives of the historical and mixing fact and fiction together. So research is important, but I'm hunting for the specific things that I can tease out and then sort of convert into these sort of aesthetic objects. So for me, research is important up until a point. As you mentioned, I was taking classes at the spiritualist camp. I took trance, intro to trance, natural law, the history of spiritualism, reading auras. So I was taking in these classes, and sometimes I was taking notes, and other times I was just sitting there and kind of absorbing information, whether or not I was necessarily completely on board with some of the information. I tried to, whatever I was doing, I tried to kind of synthesize it in the ways that I felt could be best translated into artwork.
Go to the next slide. This conversation seems to speak in some ways to this project, A Record of Disillusion, which I thought was a sort of suggestive title, and I like that when you're listing the medium, you include extension cord, floodlights, power outlets, and it did make me think about the history of electricity and Edison being someone who in his own time was considered a kind of sorcerer or conjurer. People were very frightened by the idea of electricity and by the unseen. And you might also want to mention something about the amber in this case and how that's sort of functioning relationship to electricity and this kind of idea of investigation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I mean, one of the things that we had talked about too, this is the first piece that I did back, so almost 2 years ago, that did not include photography. So I felt like I was still thinking with the sort of photographic mind or photographic brain. So the apparatus, for example, was still important to me, but this also started to translate into kind of the electrical equipment, kind of equipment in general. So again, as I had mentioned with, grounding objects, using materials, like balloons, for example, that create static electricity when rubbed together, and those are tethered to copper wire. That's also an electrical conductor. One of the things that interested me initially about electricity was trying as much attention as I could to the electrical circuits in the gallery. In addition to that, I was really interested in kind of setting up this kind of vague or evasive duality with this particular piece, wherein I was using a material such as amber, which is, again, an electrical conductor, and when rubbed together, it's also creates static electricity. And then again, using black light, which is a kind of tool of detection to reveal whether the amber was real or not, because real amber fluoresces under black light. So through this particular piece, I was kind of setting the stage for a kind of looser interpretation of allowing one side to reveal the reason that the amber has been selected in this particular piece, and that was through electricity.
You've talked a little bit about dualities, and I feel like that's also a recurring theme, but it's sort of ambivalent and ambiguous how you're using dualities. I mean, one could look at your work and, talk about dualities of sort of the corporeal and the spiritual, technology and belief, skepticism and belief, but I don't get the impression that you're out to necessarily persuade anybody of one thing or another that these e-meters really do work, or that we need to be critical of or skeptical of them. I mean, how do you sort of orient yourself in relationship to some of those dualities, and are you trying to kind of muddy the waters, as it were, and confuse some of those distinctions which we kind of assume to be clear-cut and the boundaries clearly drawn, but maybe your work wants to sort of confuse some of those boundaries?
Yeah, no, the chalk lines are pretty fuzzy in terms of, creating a, duality between belief and skepticism. I'm not necessarily interested in having the viewer take one stance or the other, but like, we've discussed in Electrum, I hope that the piece will inspire either an interest in belief or an interest in skepticism or a flip-flop of one or the other. But it's not these types of boxes that I'm interested in creating at all for the viewer, other than bringing to light the opportunities for even considering that in the artwork. So.
Go to the next slide. And if you could speak a little bit more to what you're depicting here. You may have noticed that mirrors are also operating in a lot of these series as well. So what's being depicted in this photograph, and what is the title a reference to? Again, the within without duality.
Well, what you're seeing is a tree. I'm just kidding. No, that's a really good question. So I'm really glad you asked. This is actually a cemetery at the Spiritualist camp. And it was shot around the same time that, on the same road trip when I was doing the Utopian communities. So I was kind of ruminating and thinking about the same kinds of concepts. But what I really appreciated about this particular image goes back to the, proposed vortex, for example, which is that you're not necessarily aware that this is a cemetery, right? And that in some way, what I was interested at the time and why I sort of removed myself from photography or got frustrated with it was the difficulty in representing this kind of spirituality or this kind of afterlife that was so inherent to this space. But also, again, being on the flip side, being interested in it for that reason. So for that particular reason, the mirrored acrylic served as this kind of like hotspot or kind of signifier that something else was going on beyond just this landscape photograph. That basically when you enter the middle between where the mirrored acrylic and the landscape meet becomes a kind of Rorschach test where you're kind of confronted with a kind of psychological interpretation of that work, whether it's yourself or this kind of representation with the artwork. As you pointed out with the title, As Within, So Without, this actually comes from my class, my natural law class at the Spiritualist camp, and it's part of a kind of, I guess, rule, if you could call it that, or bullet point within the Spiritualist curriculum that is essentially what happens in the spiritual realm or in the afterlife also happens in the physical world. So basically everything has a kind of consequence, but to be aware that that's also taking place within the other, between the other type of realm, between an afterlife and a kind of spiritual realm.
Can we go to the next slide? I mean, so that brings us to, unfortunately, it was Paradise, which is, really the series that kind of first introduced me to your work. And, maybe before we speak kind of in more specifics about it, do you just want to generally describe what that project was and what inspired it and what came of it?
So unfortunately, it was Paradise. Was I want to say, 2-year project that started when I took a trip to New Harmony, Indiana, which is the site of 2. I don't want to call them failed utopias, but utopian experiments that did not end up working out very well. When I was there, I started to research the history of this site of historical utopia, and I became very, very drawn to this space that again had, not even from a research perspective, but just the kind of like aura and presence, again, like a kind of spiritual presence of the site. And I became drawn to that in the sense of photographing it and trying to tease out or flesh out this kind of experience that I was having, and to see if the photograph could translate that experience. So after photographing in New Harmony, it basically took me on this utopian road trip, as I like to call it. And from there, I photographed at about 9 different sites all across the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic. They everywhere from Zor, Ohio to Nauvoo, Illinois, to the Shaker community, to I'm off the top of my head forgetting some of them, Amana colonies in Iowa. So basically, I started to look at this almost as like a compare-contrast study to see if that, not only if there was a relationship visually and aesthetically between the communities, but also if there was the same sense of, or the same essence in each community of this sort of like a kind of metaphysical space. So I found out a lot about the kind of relationship to land and the ways in which history even was presented throughout these particular communities.
And in As Within, So Without, we were looking at a spiritualist cemetery, and here on the right is a harmonist cemetery. And as you may notice, there's no grave markers or headstones or anything that would kind of indicate that there are people buried here. So that seemed to me, you seem to want to sort of bring attention to these spaces that are sort of deceptive. This looks just like a field, but once you've attached the title Harmonist Cemetery to it, it seems to speak volumes about a certain set of beliefs that the Harmonists held. And you've used the phrase before that you're interested in sort of the aesthetics of belief systems, and that seems to be another thread kind of running through your work, even up to the current installation. Do you want to speak a little bit to what you mean by the aesthetics of belief systems, and how your own aesthetics kind of respond to that, even formally, and why you sort of take the pictures you do and the format that you use and so on?
Well, I can definitely speak to the aesthetics of belief systems in relationship to the Harmonist Cemetery. I think what came about for me with this particular image was the kind of the strata of the sort of historical strata that cannot be seen but is implied through the titling information, that I appreciate that when looking at this particular photograph, it becomes again this like sort of banal, cleared out, mounded space, but then when one becomes aware that it is in fact this kind of site of the dead, or the kind of, one could even say the afterlife, if one is a believer of those things, that it starts to take on a completely different meaning, and that the aesthetics are also part of that suggestion. So now you view the photograph in a different light, and this sort of belief system in a different light, because then as one goes through the history of the Harmonious Cemetery, as you talked about, there are no gravestones, and that goes into this kind of belief system in the historical utopia, which was actually a running thread throughout many communities, where because of this communal atmosphere, people were not honored with headstones as a way to kind of create a democracy, that nobody was more important than one another, so that everybody became neutralized within the space, even in death. But going even further, this is a site of a Native American burial ground, wherein the spiritualist community is buried on top of that. So then you start to see, again, this sort of like what I would describe as almost like a layer cake approach of looking at these types of belief systems and the ways in which people honor or think about their types of communities. And all of this is conveyed through a photograph that is relatively quiet.
And bringing up the issue of the cemetery and honoring the dead and so on, it sort of speaks to another theme or a thread that I see running through, which is I was surprised to learn that the e-meter doesn't only register sort of your current psychological state or spiritual condition, but actually your past as well, and your memories and how they sort of bring to bear on your current experience. And so it seems as though memories and collective memories and so on are another ineffable, invisible thing that how can they be captured? And particularly in utopian communities that were established as spaces for creating a kind of collective existence, what role would you say that memory sort of plays in either this series or kind of in your current work, and if you would identify that as being a theme that sort of runs through?
I think as I was talking about with the utopia work, I think that's kind of clear in terms of thinking about collective or collected memory. But I think in general, talking about the work with the e-meters, while it's thinking about your body in the space, especially with Electrum, it's reading your aura, it's also reading your electric energy from a particular body. It's also reading your kind of psychological state or your psychological trauma. And of course, trauma can either be a current or a past trauma. So in that way, it's kind of accessing a kind of personal, like a personal timeline, a personal history, and that again is being quantified into readable data that one can see directly onto the meter itself. So you're kind of having almost this experience of compression between both the present self and the past self, which is being translated together onto the dial.
Utopia, the word means nowhere. It means no place. And I did wonder if it was this series where we can kind of point to maybe a certain frustration with photography, or I don't know what the word is, disappointment, or just sense that photography is not able to kind of capture what it is that you're interested in. Memory, spiritual states, all these things. And I was interested in this pairing, which you've titled Field Work, blue and gray on the left and silver and brown on the right. And you deliberately obscure, the composition, so we can't even quite pierce through the fog. And it reminded me of instances in the Bible where God appears sort of in the mist, and the idea that spiritual experiences sometimes tend to occur when there's this confusion, this sensory confusion. So would it be fair to say that unfortunately Was Paradise marked a kind of shift or a break in your practice where the camera was no longer kind of doing the work you wanted it to do or needed it to do, and hence you started enlisting the battery of UV lights and black lights and different kinds of pressures on the actual image itself to sort of do more than the surface could manage?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I mean, right when I finished this project, even when I was talking about the project at the water tower, I was thinking a few steps ahead and saying to myself, you know, I'm ready, I'm done. Like, photography, we're breaking up. Like, I just can't have this relationship with you anymore because of just solely like a frustrated perspective. You know, again, like being classically trained in photography and working with the analog and just starting to feel burdened by the process of photography. And as you mentioned, this kind of, you know, just difficulty in translation. So I think for me, like the process of working through a lot of the new installations was this process of trying to work through my frustration in different media and also having this really direct relationship to materials and this kind of materiality that I could feel and see in these spaces, in the utopian spaces, but that I could not bring back with me and translate through the film itself. So I had a lot of difficulty in doing so, but as you pointed out with field work, I think that this is where these particular photographs for me kind of resonate differently because I feel that the experience of trying to photograph, like fog was this kind of experience of trying to photograph, you know, a spirit or ectoplasm. You know, it's very difficult to capture, but in some way the haziness and this kind of obscurity was the best way to do so, like almost in an abstracted manner.
So if you and photography are breaking up, have broken up, and you've moved towards sort of this kind of conceptual realm or the realm of installation, where do you see your work kind of going from here? I mean, at what point are you able to fully inhabit the spiritual realm, you know, divorced from any kind of materiality? And I mean, how do you see your process maybe evolving from Electrum and from, you know, where you started with, unfortunately, was Paradise and your earlier work? You don't have to be explicit or give anything away, but I'm curious to hear about where you could see your practice going.
Well, it's top secret information. I can't give it to you. No, I actually, yeah, as we were talking again, it's interesting because now having had like maybe about 2 years to work kind of like on and off with cameraless or without lens-based you know, image making, so just directly working with the film itself, doing things like flower pressings or chemigrams, working with chemicals directly on the film. I think I'm finally ready to go back to shooting with large format, but I know that now there has to be a kind of marriage between the installation and the photographic, and that having now had done these kinds of installations without photography, I feel stronger as a kind of you know, artist, and my practice feels stronger because I don't need to meld them necessarily. I feel like I can work on those two things separately.
With the time we have left, I just want to make sure that if anyone had any sort of urgent or pressing questions that you wanted to ask Regina, things I overlooked or other issues or themes you wanted to bring up, I just wanted to open it up to you guys to interrogate Regina. Excellent. I covered everything. There's more to speak. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you to the Mission Gallery for hosting us. It was really, really a pleasure. And I, for one, look forward to what Regina does next.